So just before we begin panel, we also have a couple of a few rules of engagement and also a description of the modalities. We do want the panel to be interactive. Well, as much as a Zoom can allow a panel like this to be interactive. If it's possible, maybe we can stop screen sharing the flyer now. That might be helpful so people can see the panelists. Thank you very much. Just in terms of we do have, like I said, we want the panel to be interactive or as interactive as it can be in Zoom. So we look forward to your engagement with the content. We're using a question and answer format for the panel. So we'll have first round of question and answer that I will be asking for all of the panelists, and then we'll take up a few audience questions. So we request you to use the Q&A function in Zoom, which also you can see at the bottom. To ask your question, feel free to ask them as they arise, and we will try and find time to present them to the panelists. We are keeping the chat open, so please feel free to introduce yourselves and possibly meet people you did not know were attending from other parts of the world, organizations on chat. We would love for that. Please feel free to share any resources that you may have. However, we request you to be respectful to all the panelists and to each other. The chat and the Q&A are moderated by us. And so please refrain from any acts of intimidation or harassment, which we will have to then ask the person to leave. But in the interest of keeping it interactive, we're hoping you feel free to add and talk to each other through the chat and ask questions on the panelists. That being said, we look forward to having this very interactive, hopefully interactive discussions. Let me begin by introducing myself. My name is Pooja. I work at the Sexual Rights Initiative, and I have to my great delight and honor, I'm moderating this panel with these absolutely great activists and panelists, and I'm very excited to hear them as much as you are. So I will keep this short so you can get to them. Just a brief outline on what we are hoping with this. So population policies are laws and policies and other measures taken by states as a response to changing population dynamics, including by introducing measures to increase population or control population growth. Often these are introduced at the behest of states and to the disregard of the wishes of people concerned. At the 1994 International Conference on Population and Development, 179 governments adopted the program of action and called for women's reproductive health and rights to be at the center of population policies. The need for a human rights framing was necessary because many of the coercive population measures introduced were often premised on the idea that the decrease in mortality rates and increased fertility rates would result in population growth that exceeded available resources. This was one of the ostensible reasons. These coercive population measures resulted in widespread human rights violations. The program of work then and now is critical in ensuring a human rights-based approach to population and development, and reaffirmed women and girls' autonomy in deciding about their lives and bodies. Needless to say, the reason it was so critical and instrumental is the work of the feminist movement from across the world who were there at that time. Yet now we see quite a drastic reversal of these very same commitments from states. For some of us who are currently involved in the Human Rights Council, which is ongoing, we see amendments on language on autonomy, participation, sexual and reproductive health and rights. Instead of progressing on rights, we see a trend of regression in multilateral spaces. This trend is also a reflection of laws and policies and programs at the national level. But we also know laws and policies at the national level is influenced by global rhetoric and global dynamics, including development aid, funding, and conditionalities. So despite the adoption of program of action at ICPD, governments continue to introduce and implement pro-natalist and anti-natalist coercive population policies and measures. There is now a global resurgence of these coercive population policies, in particular the resurgence of pro-natalism And this can take many forms: restricting access to contraception, emergency contraception, abortion, sexual and reproductive health services, incentivizing or disincentivizing reproduction, among others. The resurgence of pronatalism often coincides with the conservative fundamentalist nationalism pursued by governments and a renewed, quite a high influence of conservative movements in policy. It is almost always anti-migrant, using racist and xenophobic discourse to push for and implement pro-natalist laws, policies, and programs. Some notable examples include Iran, China, the United States of America, Hungary, Poland, Turkey, Russia, etc. Simultaneously, coercive population control policies can manifest in coercive sterilization, coercive abortion, sex-selective elimination, amongst many other. One of the common elements of both of these measures to control population is that all of them deny women and girls the right to bodily autonomy. But these measures, as we know, do not affect everyone the same. This is not a coincidence or an unfortunate side event, as we'll see through the day. These measures target poor women who are also most likely also marginalized because of their racial, religious, and ethnic status in their own respective national contexts. It is also true that none of these developments happened in isolation, or that there weren't groups and movements warning about these developments through the years. The larger question everyone needs to be asking is, why was there so little attention paid to these warnings? Going from there, today, we have a wonderful set of panelists who are going to be talking to us about these coercive population policies and their manifestations. The panelists will also highlight the political context in which these measures came to be adopted and who benefits from these measures. Crucially, they will provide us with key insights on not only the ways to understand these issues, but also think through organizing ourselves moving forward. So saying that, I'm going to start with our first panelist, who needs no introduction to many of us, but just a brief in case, is Loretta J. Ross, is a professor at Smith College in the program for study of women and gender, where she teaches courses on white supremacy, human rights, and the calling out culture. Loretta was the national coordinator of the Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective and co-created the theory of reproductive justice. Loretta was the national co-director of April 25, 2004, March for Women's Lives in Washington, D.C., the largest protest march in the US history at the time. She founded the National Center for Human Rights Education in Atlanta, Georgia, launched the Women of Color program for the National Organization for Women, and was the national program director of the National Black Women's Health Project. One of the first African-American women to direct a rape crisis center, Loretta was the third executive director of the DC Rape Crisis Center. So Loretta, considering you were one of the co-creators of the theory of reproductive justice framework, and it would be good for, I think, everybody to hear why we should look at these population policies from a justice framework and how that can help us analyze and address the manifestations of these coercive population policies. And over to you, and looking forward to. Thank you.
Well, thank you for not only a wonderful introduction, but your overview of what we're up against is very important. I'm very fortunate to have been one of the people who thought about reproductive justice in 1994 and has since popularized the framework. We had to create reproductive justice because just talking about pro-choice or pro-life policies didn't address several issues that were concerned to us as the 12 Black women who created reproductive justice. Neither of those sides addressed neoliberal capitalism and the imperialism that accompanies that. Neither of those groups talked about population control and the disparate impacts on differently situated and vulnerable women and people who can get pregnant. And neither of those sides, in our opinion, talked about what happened to children after they're born. So we created reproductive justice to join with the pro-choice movement in fighting for the right not to have children. And of course, that includes the use of birth control, abortion, and abstinence. But because we were Black women who for close to 500 years have been subjected to reproductive management in this country, where before the end of slavery, we were forced to breed as a wealth building strategy for the United States. And then after the end of slavery, that same fertility was demonized, as if we were overbreeding, as if we were threatening the political composition of this country. And so whether it's to fight terrorism or to fight poverty or to fight crime or to fight environmental degradation, our wombs are always blamed for being the cause of these things. And so we ended up facing population control strategies like sterilization abuse, but going beyond biological questions, because we have population control in our tax policies, in our housing policies, in our prison policies, in our immigration policies, in every policy. And so we had to fight for the right to have the children that we wanted to have and have them under the conditions under which we wanted to have our children, which of course includes avoiding unnecessary surgeries like C-sections, but also the right to use doulas and midwives and to have our birthing plans respected. And then the third tenet of reproductive justice, the right to raise our children in safe and healthy environments, brings into the conversation every field of human endeavor, because it's talking about the end of gun violence, the end of a war economy, an end of imperialism, environmental issues, schools, housing, taxes, transportation, food insecurity. All of those things affect our ability to raise safe and healthy children. And of course, because I'm from the United States and y'all have witnessed the overthrowing of Roe v. Wade, the decision protecting abortion, we are dealing with a rising authoritarian neo-fascist state that is working in partnership with other authoritarian and neo-fascist states around the world, in Turkey and India, et cetera, our Philippines, I could just go on. And so instead of looking joyfully towards human rights and justice progress in the 21st century, this country feels like we are refighting the Civil War, trying to decide whether America is going to be a country ruled by white supremacy, as it was founded on the genocide of Native American people and the enslavement of kidnapped Africans, or is it going to finally live up to the promises in its Declaration of Independence, its Bill of Rights, and the Constitution? That has not been settled yet in our country, because in 1865, when we should have held those traitors accountable for trying to overthrow our government, instead we pardoned them all and built statues to celebrate them even. Germany punished its Nazis, we celebrated ours, and so we're still in the same Civil War. Is it going to be the land of liberal democracy, or is it going to be the land of white supremacy? We still don't know. And I'll close by saying that right now we're undergoing congressional hearings on the January 6th attempt to overthrow our government. And let's be clear, all of those angry white people weren't trying to overthrow the government because their votes weren't counted. They were trying to overthrow the government because Black votes were counted, and they did not like that. They do not like any time white men are not in power, so they're trying to attack voting rights, environmental standards, women's rights, human rights, immigrant rights, prisoners' rights. Everything is on the chopping block with these Republicans, and particularly the way they illegally packed and overtook our judicial branches, including the Supreme Court. So let me stop there. Reproductive justice is easy to define and very hard to achieve, because we have to go up against so many forces, not only on the right, but on the left. because one of the critiques I offer is that population control is not just from the right, it is from the left, from people who believe that it is their mission to control the fertility of women and, for example, distribute dangerous contraceptives in contexts where people don't even have a functioning healthcare system or potable drinking water. Matter of fact, I would argue that after 70 years of, quote, development, I can only believe that it's systematic underdevelopment that is actually what they want, because a depopulated country facing massive and systemic underdevelopment cannot protect its natural resources from exploitation and theft by multinational corporations and the governments that enable them. And so population control is really a battle over natural resources in the final analysis. And now in the United States, we have people re-justifying colonization, re-justifying settler colonialism, because with the accusation that people in the global South cannot responsibly manage their own natural resources. So it is required that the global North intervene, overthrow democratically elected governments in the global South so that we can, quote, responsibly manage those natural resources. That's my perspective as a Black woman in the United States. And I cannot find any reason to believe that these restrictions on birth control, on abortion, on sex education are designed for more Black and brown babies to be born. I think it's about two groups of white people fighting it out over which definition of democracy will survive.
Thank you so much, Loretta, for that overarching and overarching analysis of what's happening and sort of a warning about what's coming, which is about time we pay heed to. But it also helps us lead to our next panelist. And I'm going to pick up the thing you said around, countries from the global South need to manage their populations and their resources very well, actually leads us very well into our next wonderful panelist, Sarojini, who is one of the founders of Sama Women's Resource Group for Women in Health and the coordinator of Health for All campaign of the People's Health Movement Global. She works at the intersection of public health, human rights, women's health, and marginalizations. She's led several studies, fact findings, and advocacy over the past 2 decades on health systems, two-child norm, medical and reproductive technologies, including assisted reproductive technologies, and surrogacy, access to medicines, and bioethics in research and development, and is currently looking at the pandemic from a gender equity and intersectionality lens. Sarojini was appointed by the National Human Rights Commission as a member of the expert committee to assess the impact of COVID-19 and provide recommendations to the government of India. Sarojini, the question to you would be, what have been, in your experience, the impacts of population control policies and who are targeted from your work? And then it would be very helpful to look at the multiple actors, which Loretta has already referred to, public and private, that are complicit in pushing a coercive framework from the work that you've been doing, which kind of builds on what Loretta was also saying. Thank you.
Thanks, Pooja, and thanks to all the organizers for giving me this opportunity to be a part of the panel. And thanks, Loretta. We in India, many of us, many feminists learned a lot from your work on reproductive justice, and thanks for laying out the issues, and then it makes me very easy to strengthen and then take forward that. I just want to start, like many of us, started working on women's health and reproductive health against two-child norm and against population control policies in the 70s and 80s. That's why I said reproductive health. That time we haven't focused much on sexual health. And we realize that population control or family planning in quotes should be located in the complex intersection of gender with larger political, social, economic, and environmental structures, such as neoliberal globalization, capitalism, colonialism, patriarchy, heteronormativity, climate crisis, gender identity, racism, casteism, and ableism. This is what we have learned over the years. We realized, how policy and political processes are interconnected and how policy responses are affected by these cross-cutting issues. Moreover, in many parts of the globe, we have seen the complete erosion of democratic processes and the denial of human rights of people, especially marginalized sections and racialized groups. So for me, population control, Pooja, is not just a policy or a legal issue, but the control is deep rooted in the patriarchal mindset in all the institutions we live in. So it should be addressed from all these spheres. So the impact of population control policies, target many of us. However, the reproductive bodies of poor, racialized, and marginalized have always been a site of assessing control, policing, imposing limitations in the name of population control and family planning measures. So we have witnessed, I can talk about my country too, forced sterilizations, hysterectomies, forced insertion of intrauterine contraceptive devices, lack of safe and legal abortions under the surveillance of service providers and state, particularly on persons living with HIV, persons with disabilities, indigenous people, ethnic minorities, as well as transgender intersex people, who are often looked at as insignificant, dispensable, and voiceless in our political and social context. So here I would like to give a couple of examples, and then these are actually from our own work, the example which I'm citing here. So despite having, in India, a non-target oriented national population policy, despite achieving a reduction in total fertility rate, where the average number of children per woman to 2.0 nationally now, we still have the two-child norm and population policy in a few states through institutionalized incentives and disincentives that determine people's participation in governance, their access to livelihood opportunities, healthcare, and other social security measures, which Loretta has already mentioned. Paradoxically, while the goal of controlling reproductive bodies through the discourse of population or fertility control is pursued relentlessly through these measures, women from the Baiga community, this is a particularly vulnerable tribal group in the state of Chhattisgarh, were denied access to sterilization from the 1979 to 2019. So this decision was justified as necessary for the promotion of fertility of Baiga women. These are the women from the tribal origin, to counter their declining population. Thus, access to or provision of sterilization for Baiga women was criminalized. However, the high mortality rate amongst the Baiga, already in evidence in colonial times, foregrounds the state's perception of reproductive bodies as fragmented, as being located merely in the context of reducing or increasing fertility, without addressing other conditions that affect the reproductive body. So the perilous legal situation of the Baiga women was finally addressed only through a legal intervention by the women themselves, Baiga women themselves, through a public interest litigation initiated in 2015, which was finally realized in 2018 with the High Court order dismissal of the ban. So while coerced sterilizations and denial to access to sterilization services reflect two seemingly opposite issues with regard to the implementation of family planning programs in India, yet they both raise the questions of reproductive rights and reproductive justice and bodily autonomy for the women, often from marginalized sections. So further, these examples, which I cited above, they reveal the gross violations of bodily integrity and self-determination of women, particularly of poor and marginalized across the country as reproductive and sexual beings. The second example, it may not be related to the population control, but I think it is very important, is about the sterilization laws in European countries, which date back to the 1970s, when removing a person's reproductive organs either the testis or the uterus and ovaries being a transgender. I think that is something which has been, there were orders, but still we are tracing back. So I think it is also very important to look into these issues too. The third point I would like to make here is the understanding of population increase, creating environmental and other conflicts, which are led to strict security agenda, which is further fueled by the anti-immigration policies of most countries, and has lent support to the strict surveillance in the area of migration of people while encouraging migration of capital. So added to these aspects is the connection of the politics of identity with the eugenic character of population control. Here I would like to refer to Betsy Hartman and Anne Hendrickson's work too. Let me respond in a second to your second part, which I'm not going in detail, Pooja, right now, but the nexus of the global politics, and the population control agencies, multinational and corporations, pharmaceutical industry, their authoritarian trends, the capturing of the political space by the philanthropy foundations and the international agencies, including some of the UN agencies too, are a part of these orchestrated population control policies. So these are the impacts and the players in the population control discourse. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarojini. I mean, at this point, my mind is already going, oh my goodness, there's so much here that we can learn. So I'm just gonna go to the next speaker because I can't wait to hear the next two speakers in this great panel and introduce who will talk about one of the manifestations, or let's say two sides of the same coin, but possibly more of one side, from Susan Tamisebi, who has been working to strengthen civil society and advocate women's rights in Iran and in the MENA region for 20 years. Currently, she serves as the executive director of Femina, an organization that supports women's human rights defenders, their organizations, and progressive feminist movements with a particular focus on transitioning contexts or contexts of limited or constrained civil society space in the MENA regions. Between 1999 and 2010, Susan was based in Iran, where she co-founded the Civil Society Training and Research Center, focused on building the capacity of Iranian civil society and conducting social research. She's also the founding member of 1 Million Signatures campaign, a grassroots effort to ending gender-biased laws in Iran, and continues to maintain strong ties to the Iranian civil society and women's movement. And she's been honored and recognized for work in support of women's rights in Iran and in the MENA region. Susan, moving to you, we want to ask you, what are the current laws and policies that are being enacted in Iran and on population control and population regulation, and the principles underpinning these laws and policies? And I'm sure we can share the report that you've also done in the chat by one of your colleagues. So looking forward to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It really is an honor to be here. And I mean, I wish we weren't actually here talking about these issues, but it's an honor to be among all of you great women who've been working on these very important issues for so long. I'm going to give a little bit of a background on sort of the ideological framework under which, some of these policies have been promoted in Iran or have been established in Iran in recent years. Following the 1979 revolution of Iran, which was an Islamic revolution, we had 10 years of a very pro-natalist, environment where Iranians were encouraged to procreate and create a generation of Iranians for the revolution. But very quickly, the policy planners realized that the country cannot sustain this. So they implemented a very successful and well-recognized population control policy, or that was non-coercive. And it was very effective. But in recent years, in about the last 10 years, there's been increasing concern about the low population growth rate in Iran, which is about 1.7 to 1.8. And there's been a number of policy proposals presented to try to increase that population rate. I should also explain that, the premise of the Iranian government laws concerning women is based on a very conservative interpretation of Sharia law. So it's, it's very discriminatory against women, and it seeks to control them in multiple aspects of their lives, their public and their private lives, and promotes women's roles primarily as wives and mothers. This has been the cornerstone of the ideology of the Islamic Republic. Nevertheless, despite the many discriminations that women face, they have achieved quite a bit. So, the low birth rate, as I mentioned, their education rates, more, half of the people graduating from university are women. Generally, women are more educated than their male counterparts. There's restrictions on their employment, but nevertheless, they're doctors, they're lawyers. So they've achieved quite a bit. And so these population promotion policies now really seek to target the achievements that women have made in the social realm, despite all the discrimination that they face. And they have an ideological component to them, clearly, that tries to place women again in, primarily in the role of mother and wife, and push her out of the workforce, out of the social sphere, promote early marriage. And I should say, one of the achievements that the women have made, these are all development indicators that we know, a high age of marriage, 25 and above. So this is a major crisis for state planners. They think it's too high. They want it. They've been trying to encourage younger Iranians to get married at a much younger age. So, it's really targeting the achievements that women have gained. So for the last 10 years, there's been all this discussion about how the population growth rates are too low to sustain the population, and that there needs to be population growth policies. And for the family planning program started to be dismantled slowly. There was a lot of resistance initially, even from within the state, there was resistance. But over the last 10 years, it's basically been completely dismantled. And recently, a very controversial and extremely problematic bill was passed by the parliament, by a very conservative parliament. I should say that Iran's government is controlled by, the parliament is controlled by ultra-conservatives, the presidency is controlled by ultra-conservatives. So it is, as I think other speakers mentioned, this really is a very sort of patriarchal and, attempt at controlling women's lives and women's bodies, and really bringing society in line with their ideology of where women should be. But this population promotion policy is extremely harmful to women's access to healthcare, to reproductive healthcare, but also in terms of their bodily autonomy and control over their own bodies. And it contains many different components. One component is a punitive component, the other is incentives, and then also it has an ideological social engineering component. And I'll just run through it very quickly. I don't have to describe it all, but I'll run through it. And I'll put it in there again. I didn't mean to share it, but I'll put our report in there so people who want to read more about this and get a better understanding of what the law entails can take a look at our report, which is pretty comprehensive. But so the punitive measures, first and foremost, limits access to contraceptives and makes access to ends free access to contraceptives in rural villages and in poor areas and health houses. And this is extremely problematic because these health houses are oftentimes the only health services that some rural women and poor women have access to. And the health houses can no longer provide any contraceptives. So it's not just a matter of it being free for people who live in remote areas. They won't have access to contraceptives unless they can leave where they're at. It places great limitations and outlaws basically all bans sterilizations, especially sterilizations that are not reversible. So this basically means tubectomies for women. One extremely controversial and problematic component of this bill is the banning of prenatal testing. The law doesn't go so far as to ban it outright, but it imposes so many restrictions that basically it bans it. And a few days ago, it was announced that women under 35 will not be allowed to get prenatal testing. Unless there's an urgent need or they show a background that they might have, the fetus might have complications. So it creates many barriers for women in terms of their control over their own bodies and decisions about their own healthcare. And it further criminalizes and puts greater restrictions on abortion. We already had great restrictions on abortions, but abortion could be obtained legally, in certain circumstances, those circumstances are being reduced even further. And healthcare providers who provide abortion services or who provide emergency contraceptives will now be prosecuted, and their practices will be shut down. And if people are found to provide support for women gaining abortion at a great rate, they will be also targeted for corruption on earth, which is punishable by execution. It's extremely problematic. And there's also multiple systems set up to monitor and control women's bodies and health services. So there's a registry that's been set up for anything having to do with reproductive health, pregnancy, abortion, etc. And the Ministry of Intelligence, which is a national security agency, is now in charge of collecting this data. So it really intends to make women's bodies and women's control over their own bodies as national security issues. There are a number of incentives which again target poor and marginalized women because they provide monetary incentives. And we see that the punitive measures have already been implemented, but none of the incentives have been implemented yet. So it's extensive time off of work if you have children, more time off if you have more children, but that time off is either not offered or it hinders women's employment opportunities because employers will be reluctant to hire them. Housing incentives or supports to obtain housing for poorer women. So it rests very much on women. And, I think as other speakers said, there's ideological components to this policy that are extremely problematic. Because the state, policy planners have talked about how increased population in Iran will ensure Iran's geopolitical position. So that there is a security element to this. And also, I think they've also been criticized because they have a policy of promoting poverty among the population and a population that would be reliant on the state for state handouts. Again, a population for the state in service to the state. And for 40 years since the start of the revolution, the Islamic Republic has never been able to create a population in service to the state. I'm not sure why it's going to be able to do that now, but it's also happening at a time when Iranians are extremely poor and they're suffering because of economic problems. I'll stop there and I'll put the link to the report in the chat if people want to see it and get more information on it.
Thank you so much, Susan, for giving that and talking about what's happening. And we can see the link to patriarchal systems, securitized state, neoliberal capitalism, like they're coming through. And I guess it kind of goes to some of the work of our next wonderful panelist. Melissa Upreti is the chair of the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls, a human rights lawyer, a women's rights advocate. She spent nearly 2 decades advocating for recognition and fulfillment of women's rights through the use of national, regional, and international law and mechanisms. She's led fact-finding missions, undertaken strategic litigation, built the capacity of civil society organizations, and provided technical support for reforms to governments in Asia. Melissa, we are going to you to talk about some of the work of the working group as well around what has been the response of the human rights mechanisms, and in particular, the working group to these coercive, I'm going to take Sarojini's correction and say systems and not policies on this. A quick note to all the attendees, the next round, we'll do a short break for questions from if any one of you have it. Otherwise, I'm delighted to ask more questions that I want, but we're also opening it. So please do feel free to add them in the Q&A section in the Zoom chat. Over to you, Melissa.
Thank you so much, Pooja. Greetings to everyone who has joined us today and to my esteemed co-panelists who have set the scene for this conversation in the most powerful way possible. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to this important conversation about population policies and the denial of bodily autonomy, which has been an issue of great concern. I mean, many of the aspects that have been raised, the working group as a mandate has really looked at and been very concerned about. So, I mean, it's clear that throughout the course of history, as many of the panelists discussed, and in many places into the present day, women's bodies have been instrumentalized and their biological functions and needs are routinely stigmatized through the imposition of discriminatory stereotypes. And clearly there are too many instances of this being done by the state systematically, which cannot be understood any other way than as a form of patriarchal violence. Now, we have noted and responded as a mandate to a number of instances where women's bodily autonomy has been denied through coercive practices. As a mandate, we do have certain tools at our disposal that include thematic reports, communications to states, country visits, position papers, amicus briefs. We also submit briefs in actual court cases, and as well as the opportunity to engage in constructive dialogue with member states and other key actors within the UN system and beyond. Now, in relation to today's topic, one example that comes to mind is an allegation letter that the working group sent to the government of India several years ago about its sterilization programs, calling for accountability and legal remedies for victims. And Sarojini mentioned Chhattisgarh, and this was the case in which we had the opportunity to weigh in once we received information, allegations of violations from organizations on the ground. We have also shed light on the issue of forced sterilization in some of our country visits. So for example, to Peru and even China. In Peru, we were informed about women who had been forcibly sterilized back in the 90s, even before the working group was established, as a means of controlling the number of children born to those living in poverty. And in our final report, we did note with regret that their cases had not been effectively investigated and there had been no convictions or compensation. Now, as also noted by my co-panelists, criminalization of abortion is one of the most damaging ways of instrumentalizing women's bodies and denying their bodily autonomy and agency. And the working group as a mandate has gone far beyond any other UN entity or mechanism in terms of standard setting on the issue of abortion, based precisely on the recognition that such restrictions are inherently discriminatory. And without bodily autonomy and agency, women cannot enjoy equality and live with dignity. And our analysis is reflected throughout our work, including in a position paper that is dedicated to this topic. Now, like many of you, we have witnessed with alarm and deep concern how women's sexual and reproductive rights have come under attack in a context of rising fundamentalisms and backlashes. Now, this has been going on for a while, but it has clearly reached new heights. From our work, I want to give you one example of our visit to Poland. This was back in 2018 when we learned that the government had introduced social policy measures, as it claimed, to quote unquote, support the family as a value protected under the Constitution. Specifically in 2016, it introduced a pro-natalist poverty reduction program called Family 500 Plus, which provides cash transfers of 500 zlotys to every second and additional child subject to certain criteria being met. Now, while we recognize the immediate positive impact that the measure may have had on certain families in need, we urge that its implementation should not create a shift towards confining women solely to the role of mothers and carers in service of the family at the expense of their participation in the formal economy and in other spheres of public life. Further, what we observed during our country visit was the pervasiveness of gender stereotyping in policy and practice and the pressure that it created on women to assume traditional roles in family and society, and what was most concerning, to remain silent about their experiences of domestic abuse and violence, all in the interest of protecting the family. Now, while women's traditional role in the family was being actively promoted through laws and pro-natalist policies, advocates for gender equality and sexual and reproductive health rights were increasingly being characterized as quote unquote anti-family, and their advocacy labeled as a gender ideology. And they were being subject to increasing attacks by different conservative, religious, and political actors. Now, while our working group is committed to upholding freedom of religion or belief as a human right that must be protected, we have repeatedly expressed regret about the increasing obstacles to gender equality created in the name of religion and culture. And in this respect, our views align well with those of other relevant mandate holders. Religion and culture cannot be used as a pretext to discriminate, and one particular religious doctrine or ideology cannot be imposed on all. And we are seeing this happen more and more. And we have elaborately discussed this concern in our 2018 thematic report on reasserting equality and countering rollbacks. and in our 2021 report on sexual and reproductive health rights in crisis, where we have called on states and key actors specifically to deal with the backlash as part of a multi-pronged strategy, not only to defend, but to proactively advance women's and girls' sexual and reproductive health and rights. Now, I'll end here by noting something else that's very important to the working group and an integral aspect of our approach that really reflects in everything that we do. We consistently apply an intersectional lens and take a life cycle approach that really underscores the different ways in which intersecting identities may impact and exacerbate the violence experienced by women and girls in different stages of their life cycle. In our 2021 report on sexual and reproductive health rights in crisis, we specifically drew attention to the situation of certain populations of women and girls by recognizing them as being in what we described as a persistent state of crisis in relation to their sexual and reproductive health rights due to a number of factors ranging from historical factors linked to conquest, colonization, or slavery, accompanied by systemic violence, to identity-based and age-based factors, among others. And Loretta explained many of the issues and connections very powerfully in her opening remarks. We identified adolescent girls, rural women, Black women and girls, Indigenous women and girls, Roma women and girls with disabilities, and also those belonging to persecuted ethnic groups, including, for example, Dalits and Uyghurs, among others, as falling in this category. And these are indeed among the very groups who have been the greatest victims of abusive and coercive policies and measures that have been highlighted today, and we have drawn attention to these groups in the clearest terms. The harm done by pro-natalist policies, as well as measures embedded in a range of social practices and economic policies, again, my co-panelists referred to a number of those, that treat women as mere vehicles of reproduction without any regard for their labor is clear. And one of the outcomes of such policies and practices is forced motherhood, which jeopardizes their health and lives and has been recognized as a form of gender-based violence. And we as a mandate have consistently denounced this too in unequivocal terms. Thank you. Back to you, Pooja.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you for those, like, giving a summary of some of the work and their specific questions. Our next round of, in our next round, we were thinking of organizing around that. But before that, we have two questions. One, I think, touches upon something all of you mentioned, is how do Global North's donors, in brackets, countries, foundations, and international organizations who purport to champion SRHR contribute to coercive population policies in Global South countries? And I'm sure there might be a lot to say by all of you. So if I will open that up for any one of you who wants to, or all of you want to answer that. And the second question, which might also be linked specifically to Melissa, but I'm going to read that out, is from a disability rights activist in Ireland, and who's writing on the article on forced sterilization of women and girls in disabilities in Europe. And this is a huge problem in the USA and Europe because of systematic ableism, but the other panelists don't mention it as a huge problem in their countries. Why is that? Is it more of a problem in the West? Other than Melissa, this was also specifically asked to you. You can also type the answer on that, but if anybody wants to also jump in onto answering those questions, it'll be great. We have about 7 to 10 minutes. These are very interesting questions, so I'm going to open it up if anybody wants to go first from our panelists. Melissa, would you like to start first, and then we can see if, yeah.
Sure. So very briefly in response to the second question, I mean, of course, not the issues, the barriers, the challenges faced by women and girls with disabilities, which are very specific in nature as well, is not, this is not limited just to the West. It's a global phenomenon. And this is exactly why in our thematic report in 2021, we chose very deliberetely to identify this subgroup, this category of women and girls, as individuals being in a persistent state of crisis in relation to their sexual and reproductive health and rights, because, again, of the pervasive stereotyping, the barriers, the discrimination, and just really the complete neglect and the non-recognition of this disadvantages, the pre-existing disadvantages that they face, which really result in violations whenever there's a crisis, for example, COVID, or say any other crisis, humanitarian crises. they fare, much worse in a way. And their exclusion also from processes, right? Where decisions are made, policies are developed, responses are developed. Their extreme marginalization and exclusion is also a reason why we describe them as being in a persistent state of crisis. And this is a global problem.
Thank you, Melissa. And I saw a few comments on chat about the first question, which is, how do Global North donors who say they champion SRHR contribute to coercive population policies in the Global South countries? Yeah, I thought you were looking ready to say something. So I'm just going by your expression on the Zoom. Apologies, not putting you on the spot there.
Yeah, I wanted to speak about the donor relationships with the Global South, because those of us who have what we call the diasporic consciousness, where we feel like we have a foot in the Global South as well as the Global North, feel that too many times this whole concept of philanthrocapitalism is never, ever going to be sufficient to replace the obligations of governments and states to take care of and provide services to vulnerable people. And at all times, you not only have to question the motives of the donor countries and the donors themselves, because they seem to think that they can achieve other agendas through the bodies of women, whether it is to reduce environmental problems or to address what they call the youth bulge that leads to civil unrest, or to address terrorism, crime, whatever. It's almost as if women are the means to another agenda instead of having the inherent human rights themselves to bodily integrity and autonomy. But the other thing, that to me is the motive question. The process question is also problematic, because I find with a lot of donor agencies and donors themselves, there's a devaluation of local knowledge and local experts, and the imposition of global, what they call global north knowledge and experts, as if they would have a superior understanding of local conditions, as opposed to the indigenous experts within the recipient country. So this constant devaluation of local knowledge, I think, is also a problem. And the fact that these relationships are established with women in the global north serving as the money brokers, so that the people don't develop their own autonomous and independent relationships with donors so that they can have a direct impact on donor thinking and motives. Instead, they end up being brokered, and you spend a lot of time trying to stay in the favor of the brokers so that they can recommend you to a donor, for example, instead of being able to establish one's own voice, autonomy, and decision-making. So it's very problematic. I'll just close by saying that at one point, all of our donor organizations tended to see themselves as humanitarian organizations at one point. Then they saw themselves as technical assistance organizations. What we're trying to do is get them to become human rights and justice focused organizations. Like we say, instead of giving people fish or teaching them how to fish, why aren't you asking why there are any damn fish in the country in the first place? Who's causing that? And what decisions are being made to continue this intentional and systematic underdevelopment that so benefits the global north?
Go ahead, Susan.
Yeah, I'll respond to both questions very, very quickly. So, Iran is it's sort of a very peculiar state. I mean, it's in a state of conflict, and it's as much its own fault as it is the fault of Western northern countries. But, and one of the reasons one of the justifications for this pro-natalist policy and this pro-natalist push has also been that procreation or bigger families is Islamic. It's population control policies are Western and they're imposed. But the reality is that we are involved in this conflict with the West, and especially with the U.S. for many, many years. And we can't separate that from the sort of the internal policies right now, and especially the economic situation inside the country, given sanctions, the incredible backbreaking sanctions, which are really impacting ordinary Iranians more than anybody else, because the government is getting richer and fatter and more powerful. And, Iranians are pouring into the streets with discontent and they're getting killed. So, it's a contributing factor. Also, there is a great repression inside the country against civil society. And, Iran is very isolated, but so is its civil society and its women's movement. So this, the sanctions and Western policy against the Iranian government really impacts greatly those very people that are out there to support women's rights. So it's extremely isolated women's movement that's experiencing unprecedented repression. And that's the contribution. And I'll be glad to talk about that some more if you want, but I wanted to point that out. And in terms of the ableism, I want to say that this ban on prenatal testing, initially it was, before the law was actually passed, there was a lot of discussion on this, and a lot of people who were speaking about this and in opposition to the ban. Some of the examples that they brought up were a little bit problematic and very ableist. So this issue did come up in the Iranian context, and it was debated a little bit on social media, on Clubhouse, but this is definitely an area that I think the Iranians can benefit from the experiences of other countries. And I know Kriya and SRI have done some work on this, so we plan to translate the documents that they have and share it with our Iranian counterparts. But thank you for asking that question. And if you have anything to share with Iranians, we'll be happy to pass that on.
Thank you, Susan.
Add one point, Pooja. I think taking it forward from what Loretta has said, like I'm just reflecting our own movements, particularly in India, and on the question of funding. It was a major concern still, of course, particularly in the area of contraception. That is where the feminist movement argued vehemently about this conditionality of the donor agencies at one point of time. And we have seen that it's a global campaign, the successful global campaign. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the anti-fertility vaccine campaign. Where did the money come from? And I'm not talking about the long-acting hormonal contraceptives, but the other successful, global solidarity campaign is the anti-fertility vaccine globally, how we could stop it as feminists. The funding we have questioned, and the knowledge we have questioned. What Loretta said is correct. Though I don't want to see all the time in a north-south binary, but still there is, when it comes to the science and knowledge and medicine, and the undermining of, the knowledge which exists within the, global south, I put it in quotes. So that is equally important to, look into. And I thought we need to also go back to our, old debates at times, and then why they were so relevant, not only at that point of time, even now. Thanks.
Thanks, Susan. We have taken note of the questions, and one on nationalism and sexual engenderment and how it's used, particularly the Ghana one. I think Susan also touched upon the experience of Iran, but we'll see if we can go a bit deeper. The one particularly for Melissa, we'll include that in the next round, and the other question on human rights systems, we'll add that as a part of our next question, just so the people who are asking it knows this is how we will address it. I don't know how much we'll get to go into detail of everything, but we'll try. It's limited time. And in terms of the one of the things we have, and we've already started discussing around organizing. All of this is happening, and there has always been organizing, feminist organizing, sometimes not always acknowledged. And there's always ways of moving and to kind of think this through on how we can move forward. It would be also something that will be very important, I think, from also the group of panelists we have. And the first one that we had was for Loretta, if there are opportunities to advance reproductive justice, both nationally and internationally. And at this point, one of the questions to maintain is the human rights system the place to also look at reproductive justice? And I think that can be for everybody and not just Melissa, which was one of the questions. Thank you, Loretta.
Well, nationalism is a dangerous concept in all settings because it tends to elevate the interests not only of one country, but quite often only a certain part of the population of a particular country into a hierarchy where they justify doing every kind of moral deed in the so-called protection of their national interests. And they can even preemptively commit violence under the logic that they feel threatened by people who are trying to challenge that hierarchy. I mean, in the United States, we're dealing with white nationalism in particular. It's not just a type of US imperialism, which of course the world is overly familiar with, but a particularly directed kind that not only devalues the lives and bodies of anybody who is not white, but really justifies their extermination because they threaten the hierarchy and stuff. And so we end up with, immigrant children in cages in our borders as if they're animals without respecting their dignity and human rights. I am going to address the human rights framework, which I totally believe in, versus the human rights implementing system, which is problematic because, of course, the human rights framework is probably the greatest human achievement in terms of setting standards and norms, irrespective of race, gender, geography, identity, religion, or any of those things, that sets standards for how human beings should be treated and what they deserve. Now, overlaying that is a very deeply flawed human rights system that attempts to uphold and implement these human rights that, of course, are weakened by states that don't want to uphold and implement human rights. And we're really questioning the usefulness of a state-based system anyway, as the states themselves are very porous. They can't keep pandemics, crime, money, or even people locked behind borders successfully. And so many of our problems, environmental not being the least of them, are trans states. They're beyond the ability of any state-based system to address. And I really question whether or not in a few short decades will we even still see the usefulness of a state-based system. And if that becomes obsolete, as it looks like it's becoming, then we have to investigate what other mechanisms for achieving human rights protection and enforcement need to be implemented. And I hope it doesn't take a visit from an alien ET to get us to understand that the universality, interdependence, and interconnectedness of human rights for all human beings. And I just want to say one final comment about the concept of intersectionality. Kimberly Crenshaw did us all a great favor in creating this. And a lot of people think it's a statement of identities, that you're Black, you're brown, whatever your ethnicity or your nationality. Intersectionality is not a statement of identity. It's how your identities lead to vulnerability. That's what intersectionality should be used for, because you can have an identity that does not make you vulnerable. Or like we say in basic human rights education, every child has a right to an education, but a blind child will need her books in Braille. So you don't pay attention to her identity, you pay attention to her vulnerability created by her identity. And so I just want to correct the record and how I see people co-opting and then many times misusing the concept of intersectionality as if simply claiming an identity is a problem. A white identity is not the problem. White supremacy as an ideology is the problem, because all white people are not white supremacists, and not all white supremacists are white. And so you need to understand the importance of challenging ideologies. And I think the best challenge to a white supremacist ideology, at least in the United States, is the concept of human rights.
Thank you, Loretta. That was such a excellent. Thank you. That's all I'm going to say. Sarojini, any of the questions if you want to raise, but also particularly focusing on some of the lessons learned around the work that continues to happen and the many, I think many of the questions around nationalism are around nationalism and neoliberal capitalism. So if there's any possibility of, and various versions of mentioning trans and transphobia, cissexism, and sexual gender minorities. Just mentioning them, not that you have to cover everything, others can cover too, but just checking with you. Yeah.
Well, Pooja, I think, yeah, we need, I think maybe 2 days of coming together and then talking about it, about our own strategies and our own analysis. But I'll try to talk about, when you said lessons learned, I was just thinking, during our own panel itself, like, I think it's important we need to reflect on our past strategies. We were talking about these issues, particularly the population control, and then talking about the coercive measures of contraception over and again for the last 30 to 40 years. We have made many interventions at Cairo, and we came up with, Loretta might know about the Comilla Declaration in Bangladesh and the Beijing, and then, the recently the Nairobi, and at many international UN and other regional, local and national level spaces. I think we need to now reflect on our own strategies. So what has been changed because of all these various interventions, and what is the impact, and where do we see that? Our old demands will continue: the lack of availability and accessibility of determinants of health, and all the issues which we spoke about safe contraception and abortion services, and many things. We need to focus on the, I think, strategic use of economic, social, reproductive, and environmental justice frameworks in our campaigns. And we need to analyze the changing role of racial politics in our own population environment advocacy. That is very, very crucial. We need to explore the role of what we just now spoke, and then it was addressed already by the private donors, whose creative financing of population projects manifests over time as a powerful form of, that is something which I think an advocacy point. Our campaign should move beyond, I feel, the binary thinking and dual categories, because this is what I'm saying from the experience of working recently on the pandemic, which is often taken as a definitive and normative. For example, the understanding, what I was saying in my previous comment too, the North-South as entirely distinct has seen shifts. At Comilla, one could very clearly argue the North-South, but now I'm rethinking. And we need a more nuanced articulation in the past several decades, what we have seen. This is something we have seen in the recent COVID pandemics. Even, also it is, there is South exists within the global North, and within South also there is that kind of money which we have seen. Access to vaccines, for example. Of course, there is, when it came to the equity of vaccine distribution, there is with the recent ministerial conference at WTO, we could see the North-South divide. But when the pandemic happened, during the, the time which we have seen, there is this kind of situation which existed both in the North and South. So I think we need to conceptually, see the limitations of both the cause and outcomes of the unequal power relations. I think that is very, very important, because heteronormative framework and prejudices, they exist both in North and South. For example, even though we have a decriminalization of LGBT community, but it's only decriminalization. They do not have any legally, accepted in that way. So this is something which we need to understand. So I would say that our stance should be that we can go back and see whatever demands we have made, whether any of those have been changed in the recent years, and we add to it in what ways to begin. And that could be one exercise we have to do. If we can try and find that, we may be able to bring a different voice and start a new kind of collaboration and a solidarity, which will help us to counter the population control agenda. So I think it is also very important to bring in the representation of diverse voices, which you asked me to talk about it. I'm very glad that we are talking about, the queer and also the LGBTQI issues and the persons with disability and people who are incarcerated, which are very much important to bring them into, I don't want to say them, we all belong to the same, in fact, towards some extent. So we need to make it more inclusive. And that is something, document the experiences and include in the policy making in our own campaigns. I think that is very, very important. So I believe in cross-movement solidarities, and the collaborations is the way forward to resist the population ideologies. It's not that the lessons we learned, I think the population control promoters also learned certain lessons from our resistance. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarojini. I think it kind of, cross-movement solidarity would probably lead to, particularly so, Susan, which might be the situation, as you mentioned, it's very isolated due to some of the global geopolitics and the movement in Iran. So what would be some of the best ways we can look towards resistance look like in that context, which leads into some questions around local fights against injustices, as I'm reading, to neutralize government's interventions. At the same time, what can the international systems do? That might be, if you could cover both, it'll also, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So before I talk about that, I just want to make a very quick and simple point with respect to the broader MENA region. I think with the growth of where the increased attention to extremism and to terrorism and the policies that the global north has with respect to our region, and the collaborations that many of these democracies have with very non-democratic countries really puts citizens in a great disadvantage. And the policies that are defined for this region are based on a security policies for the West, for dictatorial, repressive governments, and for Israel. And it's really not policies that are designed that take into consideration human security and the security and well-being of citizens. So I think that, if we're talking about really rethinking policies and power relations when it comes to this region, Iran is also part of it. I mean, plays out a little bit slightly differently, but the broader region really suffers because of this power, this lens and this power imbalance. So I think I just want to sort of put that there before I go to Iran, just to have a regional view. But with respect to Iran, obviously, I mentioned that the Iranian women's movement and civil society in general is extremely marginalized, and it's dealing with serious repression, and it's extremely isolated and marginalized, and they're not involved in any cross-regional, international spaces, and it's critical to elevate their voices. I mean, clearly, if we were talking about having different groups of people, it would have been great to have someone else besides me. I've been based outside of Iran for 10 years, to have someone come from Iran and talk about these issues. And they are talking about it in their own context, but to talk about it internationally would be a security threat for them. They would probably be arrested. So really, we have to think creatively about how to engage the Iranian women's movement, Iranian civil society, who are really at the front lines and fighting to maintain their space, but also to maintain the rights of Iranians, including women's rights and bodily autonomy and the rights of LGBT and, marginalized groups and, and the whole host of groups that are sort of being targeted and repressed. And I think it's critical that we try to engage them and be creative in how we engage them. And this is also where donors come into play because of sanctions. Many of them don't provide funding to make sure that Iranians are part of the conversation. Even some people also interpret a conversation like this as being opposed to sanctions. So it's not even physically bringing them. So I think we have to, I want to ask all of you, but everybody here to really think about how to engage some of these more, not just Iran, but other countries who are also suffering from sanctions in this level of isolation. How do we rethink this to make sure that those voices of people inside the countries, in these countries, are present in these discussions, because they have a lot to add, a lot of value to add. And, along those lines, I think human rights systems, yes, I agree with the what was said before. It's critical, it's really important. And for us, it's the only thing that we have, right? It's the only space that we have. It's very hard to push Iran through the human rights systems because it's so isolated and it's not engaged, and you can't just do it only with sticks. You have to do some carrots. So it's very hard to do it, but it really seems to be the only space we have. And we look forward to working with the working group and other special rapporteurs on bringing attention to these laws that are in such incredible violation of women's human rights, women's bodily autonomy, their health rights. And we hope that the UN system and the international NGOs working on these issues will support us and elevate the voices of Iranian women in the Iranian women's movement.
Thank you, Susan. Just quickly moving on because we're running out of time. Melissa, the question is around how international feminist resist and how can international systems help in furthering feminist resistance, particularly some of the work around working group. I'm going to link one of the questions around, especially given that so much of population systems are ultimately about resources, and when neoliberal capitalism and the fact that corporations to run seems to so much of the world, then it's a big question. Then where does the working group's position also land, and how can we use the system to kind of also talk about the countering of these large, more than sometimes states, sometimes who seem to own states as well in their own weird fashion. Like where do we then look at the place like a working group and the UN human rights system?
Yeah, thank you, Pooja. Well, that is a huge question and could be the subject of another, hour-long discussion. But I think essentially the one thing I'll say is, looking at our mandate based on our work, our focus is on discrimination. So a lot of our work has to do with really challenging these gaps and unequal power imbalances and the inequalities that flow from them. So as a mechanism, we have the privilege of being in a very specific position where we are able to amplify the voices of others, where we are able to directly question states about their actions and speak truth to power. So that's the value that I see really in the work of a mandate and how we can contribute. Does that solve the problem entirely? No, but I think that without these, without mandates, without the human rights system as a whole, there would probably be a lot less accountability and a lot more impunity. And I think what you really get out of the system also depends on how you use it. So since we're also talking about resistance, I would like to note specifically that in our work, we have repeatedly called for stronger protections of the rights of women human rights defenders who often face targeted violence in response to their resistance, right? Because resistance brings with it certain risks. And this is one of the challenges that we all face. And we all face violence, whether it's online or very direct, and there's a cost to it. None of us are fully protected and shielded. So we have made very strong calls in this regard. And it's also a result of the fact that many of the requests that we get for communications actually have to do with violence against women human rights defenders, particularly in relation to their advocacy for sexual and reproductive health and rights, and against patriarchal norms in general. So that is a reflection of an enormous challenge that we all face. But with regards to the international human rights machinery, I would say that as a whole, it offers very strong tools to support advocacy efforts and for us to be able to work with civil society and other key actors. So for instance, even the thematic reports of the working group to the Human Rights Council, where we get to directly talk to states and tell them what's lacking and what needs to happen. These are actually, they hold a lot of potential and they can have a lot of impact. They shape resolution. They're developed with input from civil society. I think the challenge is that they tend to be underutilized. On the one hand, there are many reports that come out of the system, but on the other hand, there are certain reports where I think with greater utilization and strategic utilization, they could actually help strengthen advocacy and movements and also help us work together. Our latest thematic report, I just want to mention, focuses on girls and young women's participation in political and public life with a focus on their activism, and it contains several recommendations that can be invoked to remove barriers to their participation, increase their influence in the UN, and also strengthen movement building across a range of issues. And I mention this because when we talk about resistance, we also have to think about intergenerational movements and how we can work together in better ways. The communications and public statements from special procedures also can help prevent violations or strengthen calls for accountability, and civil society can be involved by sending us information through an online portal, which is accessible at ohchr.org. We can support draft laws and encourage their passage by communication. We can also critique bad ones and sometimes contribute to the prevention of passage of bad laws and policies. We work 24/7 all year round, not only during our sessions. So we are in a position to respond to allegations of human rights violations. And a lot of this happens behind the scenes, but it can have impact. And at least it puts states on notice that they are being watched. I mean, without those communications, again, states would have free reign, or bad actors would have free reign to do the things that they do. And we can also use these communications and public statements to very publicly denounce bad measures, as done recently. Within a few hours of the US Supreme Court decision in the Dobbs case, we issued a statement calling immediately for measures to mitigate harm. And these are also being used by advocates to push for such measures. So this is an example of where advocates and a mechanism like ours can come together and with one voice push for positive action. As a mandate, there are many ways in which we can amplify the voices and demands of activists on the ground. We are often briefed by activists, again, something that's not always very publicly done, but all year round, we do engage with activists. We listen to their concerns and issues, and then we utilize that information in many different aspects of our work. Recently, we issued a very strong call for an urgent debate on Afghanistan during our interactive dialogue on our thematic report. And we're hoping that this will lead to a strong resolution from the Human Rights Council and continued focus on Afghanistan. I mean, we do a lot of diplomacy with member states and other actors, public as well as private. And then, of course, during the country visits of special procedures, these are unique opportunities where we get to meet with civil society, hear your perspectives, and also give visibility to issues that others may not have noticed, even the government may be neglecting, and we may not have noticed. So we can really help contribute to the recognition of certain issues as violations. We also like to hear about good practices from states and civil society so that we can point to practical solutions and demonstrate that these solutions are possible, that these certain things can be fixed. And as a mandate, we are committed to working with civil society. We always seek information from civil society, including for our reports. And our upcoming report on structural poverty is actually going to be an opportunity where I think a lot of the things that we've talked about today and the linkages, the connections can be between coercive practices and systemic discrimination can really be highlighted. So we look forward to receiving information from you. I would like to add before I finish that we do trust and believe in the power of strong feminist movements. We always have. I don't think the working group would have been created without feminist movements and the demand for a mandate focusing specifically on discrimination. But we also believe it's very important for feminist movements to perhaps build new bridges and work more closely with each other and other movements as well. We are equally concerned, if not more concerned, about fragmentation within the UN system itself when it comes to addressing women's rights issues. And we do want to see a stronger effort to break the silos that exist within the UN. And we continue to work hard to make that happen as well. And then as a mandate, we believe very strongly in the collective action by mandate holders, which can be very strategic at times. And we ourselves have been engaging with other mandate holders to mobilize against the backlash and push back against misinformation, and also to push back against specific challenges that are being brought by opponents to settled concepts, including the very concept of gender. There's a lot of misinformation and it's very targeted. So in the context of international policy discussions, there are mandates that have been trying to work together and mobilize to push back against some of these as well. And we've also been engaging with civil society in this endeavor. I believe we need more coordination and cooperation from progressive member states as well as other actors within the UN and the private sector. So I see we're almost at time, so I'll stop there, but I hope some of these suggestions will give everyone food for thought as to how to engage constructively with us as a mandate as well as other mandate holders within the UN system.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you to all. We apologize. I think we tried to touch upon almost all the questions that came in chat or in the Q&A. Some of these would be great panels in themselves, which we look forward to if they happen at some point. There were two things that we could not, and just to mention it to all of you. One is a question of strategy on using torture as, let me just get what do you think about using a legal frame of torture to challenge forced pregnancy, implying denial of abortion, contraception, etc.? And there was one around any positive or policies and efforts to address role of population growth in climate crisis, which also could be a panel of its own. I know we are almost at time. If you can all give us give us 5 minutes. So if at all anybody wants to address this in very short, I know it's not an answer to the question, but if you do have final comments, even if not on these questions, I think I want to take advantage of the fact of having all of you here and taking an extra 5 minutes, if that's fine. So that's kind of over to all of you. If anybody wants to just do a final comment or pick up on all of that very short. Yeah.
Well, I want to attest that all of our mechanisms, as well as our laws, are only as strong as the people make them be. It has taken pressure from the grassroots, from the bottom up, to further expand the definition of human rights from Western limitations, only focusing on civil and political rights. It has taken transnational solidarity from the grassroots to bring us in conversation with each other, crossing boundaries of states and politics that sometimes didn't want us to talk about. And we have to always consistently from the grassroots, not only teach people that they are entitled to human rights, but teach them how to achieve them. And the final comment, and we constantly have to mention the unmentionable, whether it's the policies of Israel or, the way people of East Timor gets ignored or what's happening anywhere around the world. Those of us who live with the privilege of speech have to use our voices to call attention to the women and the populations who are being silenced. We're not at a point yet where we get arrested for saying those things, even though you can get blacklisted in the United States for even saying the word Palestinian. But we have to do it because, as Asada says, what do we have to lose but our chains?
Thank you. Does anyone else want to pick up on it? Melissa, please go ahead. Short though.
I think there was a quick question about torture linked to forced pregnancy. There has been analysis, there is very useful content. I think, like I said earlier, there are so many reports out there, but people often don't even realize what's there. So, as we have also reaffirmed some of the positions taken by the previous special rapporteur on torture, where a specific analysis was done looking at torture in the context of denial of reproductive health services. And we have also expanded on that. So that is something that we can make available. As a last word, I would just say that we have to continue to be fearless. We must not be defeated, and we have to draw on strength from each other. Like, we really need each other in this critical moment. I mean, that's the one thing that is going to help us overcome this enormous, unprecedented challenge. Even I feel very weary. I feel like, we're fighting the same battles again. I moved to the United States from Nepal, which had a criminal ban on abortion when I left. Now I'm in the United States looking at, all these restrictions and potential bans. To me personally, I feel weary and I feel really down. But I remember that there are all, all these amazing people, many on today's panel, in today's audience, who are all striving and trying to, not be defeated in this critical moment. So we really have to draw on each other and stay connected. So that's what I'd like to emphasize. And thank you so much, Jeff and other colleagues, for organizing this panel. It was great.
Pooja, can I 1 second? I completely agree with everyone here. I think we cannot give up our spaces. We cannot give up our fights and struggles. I think there are, many campaigns which happened in India recently, the struggles which actually showed us the path to the victory, also the farmers' struggle. We have seen it here. And it is very important to get strength from these struggles and then, take forward our campaign against these population control policies impinging on the human rights, and which is very, very important. So more discussions, and then need to be, we need to continue to have these discussions, which are very, very important to give us hope, and that we are all on the same page, and then get more strength and solidarity from each other. The spaces are shrinking. There is a massive surveillance, and then the voices are stifled with many, many, new rules. And it is very important to come together at this point of time, and always. Thank you. Thanks.
Can I just answer that, just to point to the population, the climate change question. So this is an important issue with respect to Iran, because we've been going through climate crisis for many years, drought and incredible pollution, and then also the economic crisis. So this, I think that, Isabel, you mentioned this. I think it's a really important discussion to have. A lot of different professional groups have spoken up about this new law, the population, the pro-natalist laws that, and have actually referred to inability to sustain such an incredible population growth, at least within the country. And I think we were on the right path because we were on a population decline. So, but I think it's an important discussion to have, and to look at, maybe looking at nationally what different countries or what different discussions are happening. And, just to second everybody else's, I look forward to collaborating with all of you and other groups to sort of bring attention to this important issue. And and I think it's really important bringing the different movements together. It's important to say that this is happening across regions. It's not a particular country. No particular country is demonized. It's something that's happening to women regardless of where they are. And we need to work collectively to deal with this. But thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm sure for me personally, and a lot of this is such an enlightening and great conversation. I would love to sit here much longer, and listen to more of all of you. I'm just very grateful for all of you to take the time out and give us this opportunity to talk about all of this. And I can see a lot of comments are similar. There were just a quick logistical thing. There were a couple of questions around if we can send recordings. We'll clarify that and get full confirmation, and hopefully by the end of the day, if it's possible. So please bear in mind. And thank you so much to all of you, to all our panelists, for giving us the time and having this motivating, enriching discussion, also that help various parts of the brain connect. So it's been very grateful, and and thank you to all the people who attended, and finally to the interpreters who always make these conversations possible across language barriers. I think that's something it would have never been possible, and the captioning. So I think it's been a great thing, and thank you so much to everybody for this wonderful discussion.
Thank you, Pooja. Thanks, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you, Pooja. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, Melissa.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Take care. Bye.